Hello, welcome or welcome back. I'm so excited that you're here because today we're going to talk all about habits, and specifically we're going to talk about the triggers for some of our unhealthy eating habits. If this is your first time joining me, welcome. And I'm so happy that you're here because here on the channel we talk all about how to reprogram and rewire the old habits and patterns that we have in our brains around how we eat, around when we turn to food, emotional eating, nighttime snacking, all these old patterns and habits that tend to keep us stuck, pull us back to our old ways, even when we're making some progress, and just make everything feel so frustrating. So that's what we really dive into. I post new videos here every week. If you haven't subscribed, please do so and hit that little notification bell so that you get notified every time I post a new video. We always are packing the channel with new information, strategy, techniques, new ways of thinking about this whole healthy eating business in a way that can help you really build a new foundation for new healthy habits that you can actually keep consistently, long term, and do it in a way that you don't always feel like you're kind of fighting your own brain, right? I'm all about working with the way your brain is already naturally wired, something that diets, deprivation, do not do, right? They actually have us working against the way our brain is naturally wired. Doesn't work. We know this. So my approach is really about better understanding sort of the neuroscience and the neurochemistry and also the kind of emotional connections that we have with food, figuring all that out, unraveling all of that so that we can build new healthy habits, new healthy patterns, a new healthy lifestyle that really sticks and that feels sort of just automatic, natural, no-brainer, right? Something we're not always having to work at. So let's dive into this topic of habits because no conversation about understanding how your brain works around food and unhealthy food choices would be complete without a discussion about habits. Now, you might be frustrated by your habits. You might sort of watch yourself falling into old habits and patterns with food. Again, whether that's turning to food when you're bored, turning to food when you're stressed, snacking at night when you're not even hungry, overeating, again, when you're already full, falling into old patterns around certain people in your life. So let's unpack these habits a little bit. And today I want to share with you specifically 5 things that are probably, one of these or more is probably triggering your unhealthy habits around food. So here's the thing about habits. Habits all follow a similar structure, whether they be your habit around nighttime snacking or your habit about where you put your keys when you come in the house. Habits all follow a similar structure. It's a 3-part structure, okay? It goes cue, routine, reward, okay? So you encounter some kind of cue, some kind of trigger in your life, in your day. That triggers you to participate in some kind of behavior, right? And for our purposes here, it's probably eating, but could be anything depending on what the habit is you're creating. And that gives you some kind of reward, some kind of payoff that trains your brain to then, every time it encounters that cue or trigger again, to complete that same routine so it gets the same reward, right? And around the circle we go. So if we're going to unpack our own habits, better understand them, and begin to be in a position where we can reprogram them, we have to be able to identify the components of our habit loops, right? The QT, the cue, the routine, and the reward. And so today we're just going to talk first about the cue, the trigger, right? What is triggering your unhealthy patterns around food? Now you might just think it's like a craving or I just love sweets, and that's fine, but those aren't cues for habits, okay? So we're going to talk today about what those are, and I'm going to share with you 5 triggers that are the most common, and it is very likely that one or more of these triggers is triggering your unhealthy habits around food, okay? So let's dive into those. All right, so let's dive into these 5 really common triggers for unhealthy eating habits. Take note because I'm gonna ask you at the end of this video which one of these 5 you think is probably triggering most of your unhealthy habits, okay? So see if you can find yourself in these 5 triggers. The first trigger I want to talk about is place, okay? So this means like an actual physical place that you find yourself in that triggers unhealthy food choices for you. So this could be something like going to your mother's house, or a certain coffee shop that you go to, or being in your car at a certain time of day, right? Or even at your desk at work, or your spot on the couch at night, right? If you're a nighttime snacker. So a certain place that when you are in that place, when you sit on that spot in the couch at night, or when you're in your car in the afternoon, or when you find yourself at your mom's house on Sunday afternoon or something like that, that is a trigger for you to want to eat certain things, okay? And again, because you've repeated this habit so many times, cue or trigger, routine, reward, your brain has now developed this habit loop. And so every time you now find yourself in that place, if that is your trigger, it is going to kind of cue you to want to eat, which gives you some kind of reward, which makes you, every time you're in that place again, you want to eat again, okay? So think about whether there are specific places where you find yourself wanting to eat, finding yourself craving things, finding yourself overdoing it, finding yourself feeling like you just want a little something, okay? Place. Okay, the second trigger that I want to talk about that is such a common trigger for people for making unhealthy habits is a certain time of day. So for many people, this is nighttime. The number one thing I get asked about for sure is about nighttime snacking and nighttime binge eating. So for a lot of people, that's a time of day that is a huge trigger for them. So it's like that sort of, once the day is kind of done and maybe dinner is done and all your to-do list items have been checked off and all of that, and you kind of, for me, that's what it was. It was like my time to kind of hit the couch, relax, put on my shows, and get out my snacks, right? So certain time of day. And that's, again, if nighttime snacking is a thing for you, this is one of your big triggers, right? A certain time of day. But it doesn't have to be just nighttime. For some people, it's that sort of afternoon lull, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon where you just start to feel like you want a little something, a little pick-me-up, maybe something sweet. For some people, it's, in the morning. They want that donut as they're driving to work or something, right? And again, that donut while you're driving to work, that's sort of a combination of time of day and place, right? So morning in your car, right? You go through the drive-through. So sometimes these triggers can be combined. So start to notice if there's a certain time of day that for you is when you start to feel kind of triggered, cued to start to participate in unhealthy habits, right? Again, it might be nighttime, might be afternoon, might be morning, might be anything in between. But is there a time of day for you that is a common trigger for your unhealthy habits? All right, the third common trigger that I want to talk about is feelings. Now, this is a big one because so often we are using food as a way to numb or avoid uncomfortable feelings. And I've talked about this in other videos as well. But this is a big one. And this is one that we sometimes do consciously, right? Sometimes we know like, oh, after the day I've had, or I'm so stressed out, I just need my snacks, or I need my wine, or, I'm feeling really sad, or, the brokenhearted eating of ice cream that so many of us have partaken in. This is sometimes one we do consciously, but it's also sometimes one that we do unconsciously or subconsciously, right? Sometimes, again, we've just repeated this habit of turning to food when we feel something uncomfortable that now our brains just do it without us even noticing. So feeling is a very common trigger for making unhealthy choices, for our unhealthy habits. So again, these could be so many feelings. It could be feeling stressed, feeling anxious, feeling worried, feeling bored, right? Feeling sad, feeling lonely, feeling hurt, feeling unappreciated, feeling, so many things. So feeling angry, right? Again, pretty much any feeling could be a trigger for you for unhealthy food choices, for these habits. So start to notice for yourself when you find yourself really craving things or really overdoing it, or, just really falling into those old patterns about using food to kind of manage your feelings. Are there certain feelings that are common triggers for you? Start to notice if this is a trigger for you, what are the feelings there? See if you can unpack that a little bit. What feelings are triggers for you? Because then we won't get into this in this video, but the next step then is to think about what would be a more effective, appropriate, healthy response to that feeling rather than ice cream or wine. All right, so the fourth very common trigger for unhealthy eating habits that I want to talk about is people, certain people. Now, there might be people in your life who, when you're around them, you sort of start to have certain cravings or want to fall into certain old unhealthy habits. Some people in my community call these their binge buddies. So you might have a friend that, when you guys get together, that's what you do, right? You eat, you got your snacks, or you go out for fancy dinner or something like that, right? So when you're around that person, you find yourself wanting, sort of craving, feeling that itch for old habits around food. Maybe it's your partner, maybe it's your husband or somebody in your life who brings home food, or you guys sort of have a ritual of, like, on Friday night, we always order pizza, or whenever we're together, we have a bottle of wine, So it's a person who, again, when you're with them, triggers these sort of unhealthy habits. Maybe it's, when you go to your mother's house, or your mother-in-law's house, or your aunt's house, or somebody's like that, and they always have cookies or pie or cake or muffins or something, So when you're around them, again, this starts to trigger these cravings in you, or these desires to kind of fall into these old habits. So start to notice if this one might be a common trigger for you. Are there certain people in your life who are triggers for you in terms of your unhealthy habits? And again, these things can be put together, right? Sometimes we have, like, a person and a place and a certain time. Like, I always, again, my husband and I, on Friday nights in front of the TV, we eat pizza, right? So sometimes habits come together, right? Habits like to sort of bunch together. So you might have sort of three cues that work at the same time. So these things can be layered together. They don't have to be isolated. So is there a person in your life, or people in your life, who might be actually triggers for unhealthy eating habits? All right, and that brings me to the fifth very common trigger that many of us have for our unhealthy eating habits, and that is another habit. So Charles Duhigg, who's a habit expert, calls this a preceding behavior that is also a ritualized habit. And that's just a fancy way of saying another habit. So habits like to string together, sort of like pearls on a necklace, right? Habits like to connect to other habits and build together like building blocks. So many of our habits are actually triggered by other habits. So you might have habits around eating that are actually triggered by other habits in your life. So an example of this could be something like, if you like to go, if you find yourself often driving through the drive-thru on the way home after work, that could be a habit that is triggered by a preceding habit of you getting in your car and driving home the way you always do from work, right? That is an existing habit that you have, the way you get into the car, the way you drive home, and that is now acting as a cue, a trigger for another habit, which is to go into the drive-thru. Or if you're a nighttime snacker or a nighttime binge eater, that habit could be triggered by earlier habits in your evening. So maybe by the time, maybe you have a habit of, once dinner is done, you load up the dishwasher, you put the soap in, you turn it on. That could be triggering you to then go start looking through the cupboard for snacks to have while you watch TV, right? So these habits can go together like this, right? Many of us in the morning, right, we have a habit around drinking coffee, or maybe have muffins or danishes or whatever you have. That could be triggered by earlier habits that you have in the morning, brushing your teeth or feeding your dogs or whatever it is, right? And then once that habit's done, that then becomes a cue, a trigger for the habit of going to eat whatever it is that you're eating, or make that coffee or whatever it is. So sometimes our habits are triggered by other habits. So start to notice if there are, think about the unhealthy sort of eating habits that you have in your life, and start to notice in your day, what am I doing right before I do this unhealthy habit, right? What's that? What might be a habit that immediately precedes this habit? And could that be triggering me into this sort of unhealthy eating habit? All right. So that's number 5, other habits. All right. So let's just recap those 5 super common triggers for unhealthy eating habits. These are the triggers that are probably triggering about 95% of your unhealthy eating habits. So let's review them one more time, okay? Okay, so number 1 was a place. Number 2 was a certain time of day. Number 3 was a feeling. Number 4, certain people. And number 5, another habit. So let me know in the comments below which one of those, or multiple ones, which one, maybe what are your top 1, 2, or 3 that you think, oh yes, this is what is probably, I feel like this is what is triggering most of my unhealthy behaviors around food. So let me know in the comments below, I'm so curious. So once you've identified what your triggers are, how can we use that information to start breaking our old unhealthy habits? Well, I'll go into this much more in detail in another video because it's a little bit complex. But the very first step, again, is to identify your triggers. So even just pick one unhealthy habit that you want to work on, right? To start with, we can't change everything at once. So maybe pick one that's really bugging you. Figure out what the trigger is for it, right? We've gone through 5 of them today. One of them is probably, might be more, but at least one of those is probably triggering this particular unhealthy habit for you. And start to think about, given that you're probably going to keep encountering that trigger, right? It's difficult to change the triggers in our lives. We're going to be in certain places. There are going to be certain times of day. We're going to be around certain people. We're going to have certain feelings. We can't change that. But what we can do is once we've identified that that is actually a trigger for your unhealthy habit, you can start to think about what might be a different routine. So instead of, when you get into your car after work and realizing that that's a trigger for you to drive through the drive-through on the way home, now that you've identified what the trigger is, you can start to think, okay, so when I encounter that trigger, when I get into my car after work, what can I do instead of driving through that drive-through, right? Maybe I just take a different route home, right? You can start to switch up what the routine is after that trigger. So the first step, though, is to identify those triggers. So again, let me know in the comments below which of these 5 are really, the ones that really resonated with you in terms of what is triggering your unhealthy behaviors around food. And I will definitely create a video soon where we break down more of this and really help you figure out how to change that routine and better understand the reward in your own habit loops. I hope this was helpful. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click that little notification bell so you get notified every time I post new videos. I post new videos here every week about how to really reprogram and rewire our old patterns and habits around food so that making the healthier choices starts to feel a little more natural and automatic, right? So we're not kind of fighting our own brains all the time. We're not working against the way our brains are naturally wired, which so many of us have been doing for so long. And we know how frustrating that feels. And my approach is really all about starting to work with the way your brain is already wired, right? Leverage the things your brain already loves to do to help you make healthier habits in a more consistent way and in a way that feels much easier. All right, thanks for hanging out with me. Take care, and I will see you right back here next week.